Gambling addiction can impact anyone, anytime, but military service members and veterans are about twice as likely to develop this addiction. Fall In, a veteran with a gambling addiction, tells my personal story of struggle with gambling addiction and the help and hope I found that saved me. I share this story to raise awareness about the very real dangers of gambling addiction and to send a message of hope because gambling addiction is treatable and there are people who can understand what you're going through. Fall In is available in paperback and ebook at Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. And now it's available in audiobook format on Audible, Amazon Music, and Apple Music. Are you feeling like nobody understands what you're dealing with? If you're struggling with a gambling addiction or feel like you might be, this app could change everything. eVive is an app that meets you where you're at in your gambling journey. Whether you're just starting with gambling, you're feeling like it's becoming a problem, or you're ready to leave it behind. This app provides insights and resources for every step in the journey to help you define and understand your gambling habits. There's help and hope available, and eVive is a great place to start the journey. Check them out today and redefine your relationship with gambling. Only available in certain locations. This is the Fall In Podcast. We talk about gambling harm, responsible gambling, problem gambling, with a heavy emphasis on military service members and first responders. My name's Dave. I am a veteran of the United States Army and in recovery for a gambling addiction since 2020. And my guests today are April Condemi, the Director of Trauma Informed Care, and Robin Witt, Director of Relationship Dynamics with the Better Institute. Let me say hi to both of you. Hi, April.
Hi, Dave.
Thank you for being with us. Very much appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having us. We're excited to talk about everything.
Yeah. And Robin, hello. How are you?
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you for being here with us. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's start with this. You guys practice with the Better Institute. Can you tell me a little bit more about the Better Institute, kind of where it came from, what its focus is, and then what you do within it? And let's start, Robin, with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the Better Institute is a private practice in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area, and we treat all sorts of different things. We treat individuals with gambling addiction, substance abuse, your general mental health conditions. And we do couples counseling, marriage marathons, which is new to the Better Institute. A bunch of us are certified in gambling and different areas such as trauma. And so we like to treat the whole family system when possible, and just keep everybody under one roof for collaborative care.
Okay. And April, can you tell me a little bit more about, again, what you know of the Better Institute, kind of what brought you there, and then maybe its founder as well, Jody, because Jody is very respected within our community.
Yeah, so actually I came to the Better Institute because of Robin, but it kind of like gave me that flexibility to focus on what I wanted to do, which was work with first responders specifically. So Jody has been so encouraging and supportive of me working with first responders that it just felt like the best move for me, and just feeling supported by my colleagues has been wonderful. So I work with first responders specific. Like I said, I've been doing a first responder group and kind of working on like a first responder program with Robin to kind of give to people that they can work at their own pace and kind of get that information that way too. So just giving like a variety of options for people that it's easy to get the treatment, right? Because that's the biggest thing with first responders is like getting the treatment, right? The stigma surrounding that and not wanting to go. So just making that barrier a little bit smaller instead of it being such a huge hurdle.
Yeah, and we're going to stick with you just for a minute here, April. And here's what I want to know. So we're focusing on first responders specifically within the gambling space. So let's start with you. What makes this group of people, much like me being a military veteran, what makes a first responder more susceptible to things like addictions? And we'll speak more generally, but then Robin will get more focused with you. But what makes this group more susceptible?
So I would say like their everyday life, right? Like their work is you're going into this work and you have your adrenaline is already spiked, right? Like your vigilance is up and you're doing all these things at work that like you're on edge. When I was doing a group the other day, I was referencing your training actually, I think with Jonathan that you have done, and it was comparing like military life compared to civilian and just like transitioning into that and how difficult that can be, right? You have almost like this law and order happening at work, and then at home, that almost becomes more chaotic, right? Because you're not used to that like without having direction. So like having that kind of like inconsistencies and like kind of surprises at home probably contributes to a lot of that, and just like the traumatic events that you're seeing. I was reading like one study and it was saying that like up to 900 traumatic events a first responder is experiencing in just their career. And the comparison is 2 to 4 traumatic events a civilian will experience. So it's a huge difference, right? So
Yeah.
you're having these like 900, and that's probably low, right? Like comparative of what we're thinking. So this huge number of traumatic events that they're experiencing. So that also comes with the trauma symptoms, right? Hypervigilance, irritability, you're avoiding certain things, you're having issues within your relationship, you're easily startled, on edge, right? Like all these things are happening and they may not even realize it. So then this is where like the risky behaviors are kind of coming in with gambling, right? And drinking and all these other things are happening because that just kind of quiets it, right? They just want to have a good distraction.
Sports leagues, schools, gambling operators, and others are at-risk groups for experiencing gambling harm. Epic Global Solutions partners with these groups to help reduce gambling harm. Epic's staff harness personal experience of gambling harm, along with expertise to help navigate the impacts of gambling safely and sustainably, enhancing your organization's reputation and strengthening your performance. If you're an organization looking to better understand gambling and gambling harm, tap into the global leader in gambling harm reduction. Learn more at epicglobalsolutions.com. And it's interesting you bring up that comparison from the training. And one of the things that strikes me is with a first responder is literally that transition happens day to day. So the first responder is out on their shift and in that high intensity and in that high stress and trauma, and then has to go home at the end of the day and take all that stuff off and be a regular person. Right?
Yeah.
That has to be an incredibly difficult transition. I know in the military it is, but also in the military, you're still within that, to some extent, you're still in that environment kind of 24/7, right? Whereas
Yeah.
the first responder takes off all the gear, goes home, and now has to be Joe the civilian, right, at the end of the day. And that's got to be intense. It just has to be.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
glad you brought that up because it was like as you were saying that in the training, I'm like, that's every day for a first
yeah,
responder, right? Like just that transition. And that's a lot. That's a lot for anyone to have to kind of transition with.
absolutely. So let me ask you this, Robin, and we're going to kind of focus on the gambling piece of this now. First of all, do you notice that this population, first responders, tends to be a little bit higher risk or a little bit higher in terms of the types of risk they take within the gambling? And then number two, what kind of level of resistance do you bump into when trying to start to work with somebody in a first responder position?
It is a higher prevalence rate for sure for the reasons that April mentioned. And so part of the issue is it's normalized, right? Like everybody's doing it, whether you're going to the bar after the shift or you're playing some cards. The casino's open 24 hours, so no matter what your shift, you have access to gambling, not to mention that it's legalized. So what's the harm in doing it? I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm not drinking and driving. I'm not using drugs. So there's the legal aspect, there's the normalized aspect, and then the camaraderie. You can do this with each other after shift. You can do this on your weekend, whatever your past days are. So it's a good social activity as well. The flip side of the coin is you can do it alone too. So if the first responder is dealing with a heavier trauma and they're isolating, you can gamble on your phone at home and nobody would know. You could go to the casino alone and it's perfectly acceptable to be sitting alone for hours. So on one hand, it's normalized and it's a social activity. And on the other hand, it can be very isolating and hidden, which makes it harder to find initially. And I think segueing into what April was saying about the hypervigilance at work and then coming home and having to be husband or dad, I think that's one of the benefits of, what we do at the Better Institute is with April supporting the first responder, I often will support the spouse because they don't know either what they're looking for or what's happening. And then we could integrate couples counseling as well to get the couple to be a strong unit in coping with the different lifestyle of the first responder. And I think that goes into the treatment to answer your second question as well. I do not find that they're resistant to it. I feel like sometimes there might be a harm reduction that they have in mind versus abstinence, which is okay. We always start where they want to start. And sometimes that harm reduction or safer gambling is appropriate and works. Other times it doesn't. But the first responder has to come to that decision on their own based on what works for their lifestyle and integrating the spouse and the family. What do they feel comfortable with as well? So it's definitely an integrative approach. And when we're integrating the trauma counseling with the gambling counseling, we're yielding better results. Rope in the family member, and it's really we're seeing a lot of success there.
Yeah, and you actually brought up quite a bit that I want to dig into a little bit, but I'm going to start with this first because I think for our audience it's going to be important to understand this. We have a lot of lived experience within our audience, and I just want you to briefly give us the description of harm reduction versus abstinence. And I know for myself, when I first got into this, somebody brought up the term harm reduction, and I was like, oh, no, you can't do that. You have to stop. You have to stop. So tell us why harm reduction can be an effective tool in this situation and what it looks like.
Yeah, that's a good question, and something that is often confusing, especially for the loved one, because they have the same response. What do you mean you're going to keep gambling? You can't do that. In some cases, it can happen that way. So a harm reduction plan is something that the therapist and the client will work together on. And basically it is what it says. We're reducing the harm that happens from gambling. So that could look like we're setting time limits. We're setting days of the week limits. We're setting monetary limits. And then there are different safety mechanisms that we could put into place, whether it's different apps that block gambling software that would limit, hey, you can't do this on your phone, but you can play cards with the fellas after work. So it might be limiting certain types of games or types of gambling. Slowing down the pace of play can sometimes be considered a harm reduction, whereas if you're at the casino, you're just pushing. But if you are playing cards after a shift, that's a slower pace of play. So it might be one game versus 1 hour at the casino. The harm factor there looks a little bit different, especially if we're limiting the amount of money that can be bet. It's almost like a gambling allowance, if you will, would be what that harm reduction plan looks like, versus abstinence is no more gambling, which can be tricky. You know, that includes everything: scratch offs, cards, casino, sports betting is a big one. The male population specifically, predominantly being first responders, we see a lot of the sports betting. So that's like none of that, which is, you know, where April comes in is, okay, if you're not gambling, what can you do instead? Like, what are healthy ways to cope with the trauma or the stress that you're dealing with?
Yeah, and there's two things that came up for me, and you kind of correct me if I'm wrong on this, and then I am going to expand on this a little with you, April, is with harm reduction, right? There's two things that kind of got me to step into harm reduction. Number one is if you're working with somebody and the choice is either we work to reduce the harm or they don't show up for treatment, I'm taking work to reduce the harm. And then number two is my understanding of harm reduction is that the eventual goal is to move them towards abstinence. Is that fair?
It often happens that way, but that's not always the intention.
Okay.
So the person who's doing the behavior might not be able to picture a world without gambling, but they can picture a world where they're just betting $20 a week. And sometimes the gambler can do that perfectly fine.
Okay.
You know, in combination with other coping skills that, you know, April might be working with them. Like, sometimes that harm reduction plan actually stays in play. The majority of the time, if we're being honest, it doesn't work that way. And it is a harder thing to control. You know, it's not a ingested substance that you could just not have in your house. Gambling is everywhere and it's normalized, and you might get a birthday card with a scratch off in it, and that's all it takes. And you're like, oops, like I scratched that. So sometimes harm reduction does work and it's appropriate. Oftentimes it doesn't. And we pivot to an abstinence plan.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that clarification. Really appreciate it. So April, let me ask you this. So you have clients from the first responder community, and you're dealing with, and you have a heavy emphasis on the trauma and kind of stepping into that and helping them deal with that. But when you have somebody step in who's struggling with a gambling addiction, and that's their coping mechanism and that's their escape mechanism, do you address the gambling first? Do you try to address the trauma first, or you do a combination of the two and kind of step into both at the same time?
That's a really good question. It depends on the client, right? Because a lot of with trauma, like, you have to regulate your emotions, right? If you can't regulate your emotions, and we're talking about trauma, right? Like you're at one level before you even start, and then when we talk about it, you're at the next level, right? So then if you can't regulate your emotions to get back down to that initial level, it's not going to be useful, not going to be beneficial. So it's almost like a combination of the two, because you're utilizing these coping skills that are going to help with the trauma and then also help with the gambling.
Okay.
Right? These are all things that are going to like kind of intertwine and work together. I know I work with a client now that does both, right? Like, and she sees me specifically for trauma, and she is working with gambling, and that works for her. So I think it's a matter of like finding what works for the client. I'm very like client focused, that I'm going to see where they're at. Oftentimes, and when Robin was talking, I was thinking about this, like oftentimes they don't even want to think that they have a gambling problem, right? Like it's not a problem. And, often you see that even with drinking, it's not a problem because this is what their peers are doing. This is just how I calm down. These are all these things, right? So it takes a while for them to even realize and recognize like, oh, wait, this is a problem that I'm having. We probably would start with trauma in that case. And then it's going to eventually come out that it's like, oh, I am gambling more frequently than I thought I should be, or whatever, right? So I think it's important to kind of see where your client is at and then kind of determine where you go from there.
I think
No,
to April's point, like the client often comes in not for a gambling, a substance abuse reason. So by the time April flushes that out and plants that seed, that's why we're not seeing the resistance, because they trust us now. They trust the Better Institute. They,
right.
certainly trust April. And so when she says, hey, like maybe we should look at this a little bit deeper, they're not resistant at that point anymore. So I think it's just that combination, like she said, of doing it parallel and them trusting her to trust us is a huge factor.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. I mean, what a good combination to be able to start to chip away at some of the resistance and then move forward to the gambling itself and finally digging into that realization that, oh, yeah, maybe I do have an issue here. So let me ask you, April, based on something Robin said earlier, one of the things she talked about was kind of refocusing that energy onto alternative coping strategies, right? Not reaching out
Mhm.
to addiction or gambling specifically to cope. What are some of the things that you kind of try to move them towards that you have found have been helpful?
So when Robin was talking and she was talking about harm reduction, it almost made me think like, is that even the better path to start with first responders? Because they engage in these high risk behaviors, right? Like, so it's interesting when I'm talking to first responder clients because I'm giving them advice that I probably wouldn't someone else, right? So because they're seeking this adrenaline rush, be like activities, I kind of gear it towards that, right? What are some positive, be like high risk activities that you can do that are going to be more positive, but give you that adrenaline spike that you're kind of searching for? Certainly, you don't want to go on a motorcycle without a helmet, but like even just harm reduction there of like, being safe around that, or like skydiving or go rock climbing, or all these things that are active that are going to give you that adrenaline spike have been helpful for them. Even just their community and getting involved in their community is a great avenue to go in as well. It also helps with compassion fatigue, is volunteering, despite what we would think, because their job is thankless, right? So it's nice to be able to have that space that you're getting thanked for what you're doing. So that actually helps build like their coping skills, and it helps with compassion fatigue that they have something else to put their energy towards. So those are kind of like a little bit of those coping skills.
And I like that balance between, the adrenaline replacement, the high energy replacement, and the compassion and the purpose, if you will, giving this
Mhm.
person a purpose. I guess my question is, as you get into and you look into some of these adrenaline replacements or alternate activities that can create this, is one of the goals to kind of taper that adrenaline as time goes on, or do you kind of maintain that intensity and kind of let them figure out that path on their own?
I think they'll kind of see that the adrenaline doesn't have to be there, right? So
Okay.
again, it's just like that transition down to, you can have that certainly, and I think it's important to have it somewhere. in your life, but you can't maintain that adrenaline, right? Like that's just not healthy for us. And,
Right.
that's just not a good thing in general to have that like hypervigilance, and it's going to add to some of that trauma. So finding the balance, but also allowing still for that positive space for it. And then eventually you'll see it like kind of taper off because they don't really need that anymore, right? It's not filling that need to have that adrenaline because they're doing all these other things.
Yeah, and that's kind of where my thought process was with that. So thank you for filling that in because I know
Yeah.
also within the military space, particularly with combat veterans, you've got a very similar situation. They come from that high intensity environment and have trouble recreating that sort of intensity. Eventually, as they begin to develop purpose, that need for intensity starts to at least wane a little bit, somewhat naturally. I guess, Robin, the same question for you as it relates to I guess dopamine and the rush that comes from the gambling as a replacement. Do you notice too the same thing that as even with harm reduction, as you get further into it, that need for the dopamine spike kind of wanes off a little bit, and you don't see quite as much, reach for excitement?
Yeah, I see that on my end as well. And I think to your point, when they have their identity at work and that adrenaline at work, you almost have to help them in the family unit see, well, you are also a dad and there's value in that and there's joy in that in your date nights in your neighborhood in your community. So I think they start to learn that there's different hats that they can wear and each hat is valuable. And kind of circling the family back into that, going back to what April was saying, the benefit of working with the family member, the spouse, or the couple is when the beginning of treatment is happening and they're trying to learn the balance between adrenaline and rest. Oftentimes we see a spike in arguments in the home. We see possible infidelity because they're not getting it now through a substance or gambling. You can't skydive every day or rock climb every day. So what can you do though? You can fight with your spouse. You could nitpick the kids. You can be unfaithful in your marriage. And so I think with me working with the family unit, the couple, or the support person really helps them to understand and support too. Like, okay, hold on. Are you really mad about something I did? Or are you going through something right now? And of course, not saying it directly like that, but I think just for the spouse to know, hold on, this isn't about us. This is something that they're working through. Let me support you there is helpful as well.
Yeah, and that brings up an interesting question specifically about affected others, right? So you have somebody that's coming into this treatment, and you, Robin, are dealing with them specifically for the, more intensely for the gambling issue itself. Oftentimes, when an affected other comes in, that's a whole different dynamic right there, and you see a person who, number one, has no idea how this could have happened, right? And then number two, wonders what they can do to control it, if you don't mind me saying it that way, because oftentimes that's what kind of how it comes out. How do you navigate those waters at first with the affected other to then start to bring them together as a team?
Yeah, great question. The first part is gambling education because the regular citizen, if you will, doesn't really know about gambling as a problem. So just really educating them on the gambling aspect and the problematic side of that and how it affects the brain. So once they're educated, they're open to see this as, oh, like this is something they're struggling with. This isn't something they're purposely choosing to hurt me. Gambling's the hidden addiction, right? So oftentimes by the time the spouse finds out, the car is being repossessed, the house is about to be foreclosed. Gender stereotype is the male is paying the bills, the male is sort of the one heading up the finances. And if that's stereotypically true in the home, the spouse often doesn't even know what's going on with the finances. They know the money's there and they do what they do until the money's not there. So
Yeah.
there's often that trauma experience that the significant other is experiencing too. So building back trust takes time, and them understanding gambling and then roping in the couple. We actually see that with gamblers, starting couples counseling early is actually more beneficial, whereas with a substance abuse, the couples counseling often starts later.
Okay.
So the support person has an active role. We call it like loving with detachment or supporting versus enabling. And those are
Right.
just word nuances, but it's something we as the clinicians really help the significant other and the couple work with in terms of recovery.
And April, I guess similar question in that from a trauma perspective, do you also get involved in terms of an affected other? Because an affected other can be from trauma as well as from addiction or gambling. Do you deal specifically with the affected other and then do the same thing, kind of bring them together as a team?
So actually, Robin gets all of the spouses, right? So
Okay.
we try to tag team that early on too, because we know that the family is affected, right? Because even if they don't even understand like what is this, right? They don't even put the term trauma on it. Just understanding like their symptoms, like it's creating chaos, to go to my earlier point, like it creates chaos in the home. So it's nice to be able to have the spouse understand like what the first responder is experiencing, right? So if they both experience like that psychoeducational about like what is trauma and how is this affecting us, and
Right.
oh, these are the high risk behaviors that you're engaging in, then they create this understanding of like, okay, that's why I do what I do. And that understanding helps the relationship. And Robin, you can talk more on that, like helps the relationship so much, because then it's not like, well, why are you being so mean to me, right? Or why are you being so irritable, or why are you cheating, why is this stuff happening? And there's a reason for it. They just don't understand it. So knowledge is key. And when Robin was talking about that, I'm like, that is so important, I think, for the gambling, the trauma, all of these topics, like to have the education and understand what is going on with you.
And then as you get further into it, and Robin, I'll kind of bounce this one back to you. So you've started off, you've had a conversation with the affected other and done some education, right? You've begun working with the client. You've started to bring them together, right? Now, once you've kind of gotten them to come to the table together, how do we develop them as a team? Do we start to work with them as a team, or do you still work with them more individually to kind of navigate the waters, or does it just depend on the situation?
I think that's really where you start to work with them as a team and as a unit. And what I try to start with is basic understanding. So the psychoeducation has happened,
Mhm.
whether it be infidelity, trauma, gambling, substance abuse, but now they have to understand each other's worlds together. So they might understand them separately, but now to say to your spouse, hey, this is what I'm experiencing at work. This is how I feel when I come home. And when the house is a mess and dinner's not ready, this is how my body reacts to that.
Okay.
For the partner to be able to understand, oh, okay, and then repeat that back. So what I hear you saying is when you come home from a particularly hard shift and this is what you encounter, you feel like this. And so he or she could then say, yes, like that's what I feel. So once they understand each other, we put that into play. And just that alone starts smoothing that foundation of friendship, of trust, of that emotional intimacy. And we build everything up from there.
And that's a great path. It sounds to me like a great path to take. It sounds like an effective path too, because we're starting off talking to each individual person and kind of figuring out where they are, educating them, and then beginning to kind of bring them together as a team. As long as each team member accepts that support from the other, you've got a really good team that can move forward and work together. That's fantastic. Do you put roadblocks in place? Do you work hard on roadblocks, especially for an abstinence-based program, for things such as turning over finances, self-exclusion, all those sorts of things?
Yes, absolutely. It's like a dance between both clinicians, whereas the clinician that's working with the gambler, whether that be April or somebody else on our team, and then myself working with the spouse or the family, like the couple. I don't know if I never called them roadblocks before, but I think that fits. But yeah, absolutely. Whether it's an app that's blocking gambling sites, there's self exclusion programs. There is things that we do with finances and budget and debt repayment plans that everybody gets on board with. So there's absolutely steps that we generally take when working with somebody who gambles and then that family unit.
April, question for you. When find somebody who is in that field, who is in a high stress first responder type of a field, how do I begin to know that it may be time for me to seek help? What are some of the signs and symptoms early on that could tell me, hey, I might be moving in an unhealthy direction here. Let me look for some help.
In an ideal world, everyone who is in a tough field would see someone. That's in an ideal world, even before the symptoms are happening, right? Because I was joking, but not so much joking with the group that I had actually yesterday about like you're almost handed this diagnosis of like acute stress disorder, which is just like basically after you experience a trauma, you're having all these trauma symptoms, right? The unwanted memories, the flashbacks, the irritability, you're avoiding things, all these things, right? So you're almost handed this diagnosis and you're not having any help as a result from your department or your administration, anyone. So I think it's important to get ahead of these things. And that's an ideal world, right? But that's not what's happening. So I think oftentimes people will see that it does kind of lie in the relationship. They're seeing issues within their marriage or their relationships, that they're just snapping at their kids or getting more irritable. I feel like the irritability piece is probably the biggest one that they're
Okay.
seeing, like I'm seeing them come in with, right? I can't communicate with my spouse, or I'm impatient with my kids, or all these things that are happening within the relationships. And that's almost the catalyst to then be like, okay, well, what's going on here deep in? And you then see this like these traumas unfolding and all the symptoms that are kind of relating to that.
And Robin, same question from the gambling perspective. If I'm out and I know that I'm a sports bettor and I'm on an app sports betting, or I periodically go to the casino, what are some of the things that I can look for to start to say, hey, maybe I need to start asking some questions here?
Yeah. So I think just those traditional warning signs of you're spending more time gambling than you intend to, you're spending more money on the activity than you intend to. A hallmark sign is if you're chasing your losses. In other words, you lost $200 and now I have to earn that back. And so you sit there and you do these bets until you get that 200 back. Obviously, we know that's not going to happen. Like odds aren't in your favor. So you're not likely to get that 200 back. So then you're spending more and more being preoccupied with the gambling. As April said, irritability is also a symptom. So it's almost tweezing out what's what here, because a lot of those symptoms do overlap. Isolating. And I think it's important for first responders to know these symptoms, not only for themselves, but for their friends. Like if their friend is canceling plans or they're always at the casino, they don't have money, they're not grabbing lunch when everyone's sitting down to eat. Like, why? What's going on? Why don't you have the funds for that? And so I think to kind of break that stigma and for first responders to support each other is something that is really important and just doesn't seem to happen enough. So this is information for everybody. Like you might recognize this in somebody you work with, and to be able to sit them down and say like, hey, is everything okay? Is really important.
Yeah, and I think you hit on something important too. If I am the person that's noticing these things in somebody else, the way I approach that conversation is really important too, right? Like, as opposed to me walking up to them as, and I'll use the military reference because that's the reference I know, as a battle buddy and saying, hey, looks like you're screwing up over here, right? No, that's not the way I'm going to approach it. The way I'm going to approach it is to say, I'm noticing you're not quite the same. Are you okay? Is everything okay? And is there anything I can do? And even there's a point where I wish that somebody had pointed out to me, hey, I noticed you're not around as much as you normally are, or I've noticed you're borrowing money more than you normally do. Are you okay? Not even to say, hey, I think you have a problem, but just to kind of bring it up as a question. So I like that you phrased it that way, because I think that's important, because it might get somebody to step forward without resisting quite as much, like none of your business. I mean, we're trying to avoid that. Is that fair? Is that a good way to say that?
Yeah, I was gonna say, even to add to that, like, don't stop trying and don't stop
Yeah.
having that conversation, right? Because someone is going to be defensive.
Yeah.
They don't want to admit that they need the help, but it's like knowing that someone's there, it maybe eventually you're going to break that ice. So don't stop trying and don't stop having that conversation. But yeah, it's definitely like it's not what you say, it's how you say it. And I think how you approach it is important. And even if you don't have a close relationship with that colleague, or that obviously a friend you would, but for maybe a colleague, maybe have that conversation with someone that's closer with them so then they can go to them, because that will definitely change the dynamic there. And they may not get help, or they may be more defensive, and then that's just going to trigger some other things that are happening. So don't stop trying, and just be mindful of the words that you're using.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So how can, and I guess I'll throw this to you, Robin, how can somebody learn more about the Better Institute?
So our website's a great resource. It's very detailed, and we can reach beyond Pittsburgh because we do offer virtual individual counseling, couples counseling, marriage marathons. April's group is also virtual, so we have a reach beyond Pennsylvania. So that's important for people to know. Our office is located in Mount Lebanon, so if the in-office is your preference, that's where we are, and you could find us there. But we're on Facebook and Instagram and all those platforms, but our website would be the best resource. And I know April and I are just so passionate and believe so strongly in what we do. Like, we'd love an email. We'd love to hear from you, and even just connect and see if we can maybe help or be a resource to somebody that you love.
April, any last messages, any messages you want to send out to somebody who might be listening to this, who might be questioning whether, might be looking for something more?
I would say, like, you're strong for wanting to get the help, right? Like, that doesn't mean that you're weak in any way, shape, or form. And I know that's hard to internalize and accept, but seeking help and seeking support is the best way to go to help manage these symptoms. And there is help out there, and there's non-traditional like counseling that would be helpful. And I like to say that I do that, and there's other clinicians that will do that too, right, to make it more comfortable and not be so clinical. I think that's like a huge barrier, but just ask for help. And even if you just talk to a friend, odds are like you guys are breaking the stigma within. So definitely have those conversations, and hopefully you find that person that can help you.
Fantastic. And I'll say, just to kind of close it all up here, what I'm going to say is, if you are in crisis, there's a national helpline, 988. If you are a veteran, press 1. And you're also welcome anytime to either email me, fallinpodcast@gmail.com, or check out my website, daveyeager-fallin.com. Robin and April, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I really appreciate the information, and I really appreciate what both of you are doing. Thank you so much.